Hey guys, I asked Sean from the Agatan Foundation if he'd be willing to make a compilation video of me, the best of TJump, like he's done for so many other great atheists like Hitchens, Harris Dawkins, and Dennett. And he graciously agreed. Compilation videos are really important in spreading the ideology because they highlight the most interesting and intriguing points that people have to offer without forcing someone to go through a 2 hour long debate, which most people just don't have the time or interest to do. So if you haven't yet, go check out the Agatan Foundation YouTube channel. They make some of the best compilation videos I've ever seen. So from my perspective, I think if there was an all-good, all-powerful God, it would have created a world where every single person essentially gets their own universe and they can do whatever they want with it. You can still have free will and suffering and evil. You just aren't forced involuntarily into any position that you don't voluntarily choose to be a part of. And that seems to me the only world that an all-good, all-powerful God could create. Anything else is just, by definition, slavery. So because we don't each have our own universe that we can choose to be a part of, and we're forced against our will to be a part of this world, it means that God must necessarily be immoral for putting us into this situation. So because there's a difference between these two things, the stuff in our head and the stuff in the world. If you're making a claim about something existing in the world, like if I said I saw a dog, well, then you're going to need evidence not just of something in your head, like your personal testimony, but you're going to need evidence of something in the world, like the dog. So if someone says they saw a dog, it's reasonable to believe they saw a dog because dogs have an implicit empirical evidence in the statement dog. We have their taxonomy, their phylogeny, their bones, their genetic makeup, how to train them, what they're allergic to. All of that is entailed in that idea of a dog, but none of that exists for the word unicorn. Unicorns don't have an implicit empirical basis like that, which makes it not reasonable to believe the testimony of a person who says they saw a unicorn. So the difference is when someone says they saw a dog, you have the combination of their personal testimony that I saw a dog, in addition to the evidence of reality of the empirical background of what dogs are. And that's what makes it reasonable to believe someone if they told you they saw a dog. But that isn't the case for unicorns, because all you have in the case of unicorns is their testimony, I saw a unicorn. And without that empirical basis behind it, it wouldn't be reasonable to trust them. So until they can provide like DNA of the unicorn, or they can show you a place where you can go pet and touch the unicorn and see it yourself, then it's not reasonable to believe their testimony that they saw a unicorn. So to shorten this, you need evidence proportional to the claim to make it reasonable to believe.
Right, and then we have alternatives where we go with more scientific truth, prioritized worldviews like secular humanism and atheism, who reject the Jordan Peterson kind of truth that is adopted in Christianity, and then adopts more of a scientific kind of a truth and say this is the true ethic that we should follow, and it is a better ethic. Because when we follow science, we make a lot better progress in reality than when we follow the religious kind of Jordan Peterson ethics.
So I would argue that that is the axiom of the anti-theist and the secular humanist belief system, that factual truth will always produce better results. And I gotta ask, like, citation needed, like if a belief system produces maladaptive behavior, then it's not going to be a good ethic. And from what I've seen, and Jordan Peterson has gotten a hard time for talking about this, but where atheist societies come into existence, where the rationalists gain power, the scientific types gain power, there usually tends to be widespread slaughter. So maybe that ethic isn't adaptive.
Well, let me ask you about that, because is there widespread slaughter in Iceland, Sweden, Norway, Germany, Denmark, any of the places, Japan, any of the places that have majority atheists? Like, where is the widespread slaughter where they're all atheists?
Well,
the microevolution causes the DNA to change, and there's the new child can have a better survivability, and then that new child can have microevolution, which causes its genetics change, and that its child can have better survivability. And we keep adding survivability, then the child that's like 1 trillion down the line will have a whole lot more survivability than the first child. So much so that it could possibly explain all the different species of life, because they all have different levels of survivability.
That's a fairy tale, but you're welcome to believe it. That's not what we see. What we see is cows produce cows, and you get varieties that happen. You get cows that give more milk, cows that have more beef, cows that can run faster, but you're never going to get a cow with a jet engine that can travel around the world in 24 minutes. You're not going to happen. There are limits. Yes, there are variations that happen, but there are limits to the variation, and they have to already be in the gene code.
I
Already
agree.
in
I agree completely. So as far as I know, the limits on evolution are one, it can only create things that are selected for by the environment. It can't break the laws of physics and it can't break the laws of logic. Those are essentially the limitations. And as far as I can tell, again, all forms of life are just different combinations of ATCG. So if you have one single-celled organism even that can mutate and have a child who has more survivability, and that mutates and have a child to have even more survivability, which we can observe this in fruit flies and butterflies and rats and mice. We see this happening just with microevolution, where some children have more survivability than others. It seems reasonable, since this more survivability is just a different combination of the ATCG, that we can get the entire diversity of life starting from a single cell with just that ATCG and more levels of survivability. Just like counting 1 + 1 + 1 + 1, we can do to 100. We can't do it to a trillion, but it's reasonable to believe that we can go with this process to a trillion. They seem like to be the exact same thing to me. I don't see the difference.
I believe there is no evidence for the existence of God. And when we're talking about evidence, what we're looking for is some reason to believe God exists in reality and not just in our imagination. Therefore, evidence would need to be something that can differentiate between our imagination and reality. And none of the proposed evidence or arguments that theists present can do this. So I don't think there's any evidence for God. Pretty much all apologist arguments are gods of the gaps, which I define as a kind of argument from incredulity, meaning I cannot imagine X could do Y, therefore X can't do Y, or I can imagine X can do Y, therefore X did Y. For example, I can't imagine how Y could be explained naturally, therefore God. If you break this down to its component parts, it's I can't imagine how Y could be explained naturally. I can imagine how Y could be explained by God, therefore God did Y. Now, obviously, the fact that you cannot imagine something is not evidence it cannot occur, and the fact that you can imagine something isn't evidence it did occur. More sophisticated versions of this fallacious argument do not explicitly state the person presenting the argument can or cannot imagine something. Instead, they present an argument from their imagination explaining why they can or cannot imagine something. Unlike empirical evidence, this method can't differentiate between imagination and reality. So instead of explicitly stating, I cannot imagine X did Y, the sophisticated argument from incredulity would be an argument such as X did Y as a contradiction, or X did Y cannot happen, or X, it's impossible that X did Y. So for example, take the argument, Y has no possible natural explanation. The supernatural can explain Y, therefore the supernatural exists. The problem with this argument is that there is no way to rule out all possible natural explanations, so as we don't know everything about the natural world. There could be an infinitely many things about the natural world we simply don't know yet. So there could always be an unknown natural explanation that we cannot rule out. Therefore, this argument is stating a fact, not stating a fact about reality. It only tells us about the psychology of the person stating the argument, namely that they can't imagine a natural explanation. If at some point we later discover that there is a natural explanation for X, even though they said it was impossible, well, then obviously it wasn't impossible after all, necessarily meaning their argument wasn't a statement about reality. It was a statement about their perception. They couldn't believe it was the case. This kind of argument has been used many times throughout history. One of the most notable examples is the argument used against Einstein's general relativity, in which time can bend. Many philosophers would argue that, well, time is a philosophical concept, so it can't bend. Yet we discovered empirically what it actually does, meaning that their argument was necessarily an argument from incredulity. They were simply stating they couldn't imagine time could bend. Therefore, they assumed that that was true about reality and then rejected Einstein's theory because of that, making it an argument from incredulity. Other common examples would be life cannot come from non-life, consciousness cannot come from non-consciousness. Typically, a gaps argument follows the form of nothing we know of can explain X. I can make up an explanation of X. This is evidence of my explanation. The more sophisticated versions go something like, given what we currently know, it is really improbable X can do Y. I can imagine G, and if G exists, Y would not be improbable, therefore this is evidence of G. The most common example of such an argument is the argument from the resurrection of Jesus, which goes something like, it is really improbable that a natural explanation can explain the historical accounts. I can imagine if God existed or if the resurrection did occur, this would be a good explanation of the historical accounts. Therefore, this is evidence of the resurrection, God, or miracles. It's because that these things that don't have an empirical basis are not reasonable to believe purely based on testimony. That would mean that all such things, doesn't matter what the testimony is or how much there is, would be reasonable, not be reasonable to believe. So miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, the supernatural, UFOs, none of those would be reasonable to believe based purely off of testimony. And in the case of Jesus and the resurrection, all we have is testimony, and not just testimony. Testimony from thousands of years ago in old documents. So based off of just that
evidence of testimony, without an empirical basis that miracles can happen at all, then there's no reason to accept that the resurrection actually did occur in any sense. One of the things Jonathan mentioned was a court case. In a court case, miracles are essentially thrown out prima facie. Like they're not accepted. Miracles, magic, mythical creatures, paranormal, supernatural, all of those things are just dismissed immediately from a court case because there is no empirical basis for those things. We ended witch trials hundreds of years ago. There are many court cases that have been attempted in the states today. For example, in 1971, the United States versus Mayo versus Satan and his staff, which was thrown out. And Jones versus God, a civil suit against God and Jesus. I kind of wish that one went through. There is the Stembowski versus Accolade, which is a case about a haunted house. That one also got dismissed, surprise. And there's a habeas corpus suit against God, who listed God as a defendant in Harris versus the Attorney General of Pennsylvania. All of these are thrown out because miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, supernatural, and UFOs, all the things that lack an empirical basis, are not reasonable to believe just based off of someone's testimony. And the same is true of the testimony of the apostles and the resurrection of Jesus. It's just an account that someone had. And until they can provide something greater than their testimony, then there's no reason to believe it was anything more than something in their head. To summarize, conceptual claims require conceptual conclusions, conceptual claims require conceptual evidence, empirical claims require empirical evidence. So the conceptual evidence of the testimony of the Gospels is only sufficient to justify the conclusion of the conceptual conclusion that it was something in their head, a delusion, a hallucination, misapprehensions, fabrications. Any of those things would be reasonable conclusions based off of just the testimony that they provide. But it would not be reasonable to conclude that the resurrection actually happened on that testimony until they can provide a further basis of evidence, like demonstrating that miracles can happen in some way. This episode of the TJump podcast is brought to you by you. If you value this content, please consider supporting the channel.